Human saves abandoned girl. In blizzard 20 years later, she becomes queen. Jakob Heron heard the cry through the screaming wind. A child's voice, weak and fading, swallowed almost instantly by the blizzard's roar. He stopped mid-step on the supply run back to his cabin, every instinct screaming at him to keep moving. The whiteout was worsening, temperature dropping to -40. He had maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia set in, even with his military-grade thermal gear. The smart play was to get inside, bolt the door, and wait out the storm like he'd done 100 times before. He turned toward the cry anyway. Through sheets of driving snow, Jakob spotted her. A small figure collapsed in a drift, half buried, skin an impossible shade of violet against the white. 4 years old, maybe 5. Valkorian. High-born judging by the silver markings tracing her temples and collarbone. Intricate patterns that marked nobility as clearly as a crown. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow. She wore nothing but a thin ceremonial robe, already frozen stiff. Someone had left her here to die. Jakob's jaw clenched. He'd spent 15 years in this frozen hellscape precisely to avoid moments like this. Moments that required him to care, to act, to risk the fragile peace he'd carved from isolation and routine. He'd buried those instincts along with his old life, his old squad, his daughter's grave marker back on Earth. The girl's eyes fluttered open, violet like her skin. They locked onto his face with desperate animal hope. "Damn it," Jakob growled and scooped her into his arms. She weighed nothing. Her body was rigid, already shutting down. He tucked her inside his thermal coat against his chest, feeling the shock of her frozen skin against his own warmth, and ran. The cabin was 300 meters. Might as well have been 3 kilometers. The wind tore at him, trying to rip her from his grasp. Ice formed instantly in his beard, his eyelashes. His lungs burned with each gasping breath of air, cold enough to crystallize moisture in his throat. He crashed through his cabin door with 30 seconds to spare before his own core temperature would have hit critical. The next hour was pure medical protocol. Jakob's hands moved with the muscle memory of 2 decades as a military medic. Strip the wet clothing, warm blankets, not hot, gradual rewarming to avoid shock, IV fluids, monitor vitals. Her heartbeat was thread-like, her breathing ragged, advanced hypothermia, severe malnutrition. This hadn't been a sudden abandonment. Someone had been starving her first. As the storm hammered the cabin's reinforced walls, Jakob worked in grim silence. He treated battlefield casualties, trauma victims, soldiers who'd lost everything. But there was something about the small, fragile body on his med table. The way her tiny hand had clutched weakly at his coat, even in unconsciousness, that cracked something in his chest he'd thought permanently sealed. By dawn of the first day, her breathing stabilized. By the second, color returned to her lips. By the third, when the blizzard finally broke, her eyes opened fully for the first time. She looked at him with a clarity that shouldn't exist in a child so young, so traumatized. "You're safe," Jakob said quietly. The words felt foreign. He hadn't promised anyone safety in 15 years. She didn't speak. Couldn't, maybe, or wouldn't. But she reached for his hand with both of hers and held on like he was the last solid thing in a universe of ice. Jakob contacted the colonial magistrate as soon as communications cleared. Filed the report. Found child, approximately 4 years old. Valkorian noble markings, abandoned during the storm. He waited for the system to work, for frantic parents, for a missing persons match, for someone to claim her. No one came. The magistrate, a bored human administrator who'd been exiled to Frostholm for reasons he never disclosed, barely looked up from his datapad. Highborn Valkorian kid dumped in a blizzard? That's political disposal, friend. Happens more than you'd think. Rival houses, succession disputes. Cheaper than an assassin and looks like an accident. He shrugged. I'll file it with planetary services. They'll send her to a colony orphanage eventually. Might take a few months. You good to keep her until then? Jakob looked at the girl. She sat at his table, wrapped in blankets too large for her frame, eating protein rations with mechanical precision. Her eyes tracked his every movement. She hadn't let him out of her sight for 3 days. Yeah, Jakob heard himself say, I'm good for it. The magistrate never followed up. Planetary services never came. And Jakob, who chose an isolation, who deliberately cut every tie to avoid the pain of loss, made a choice he couldn't unmake. He named her Alara, after the daughter he'd buried 20 years ago. He taught her to survive the ice, to read, to treat wounds, to shoot straight. He watched her grow from a silent, traumatized child into someone remarkable, brilliant, compassionate, fierce in her loyalty. She remembered nothing before the blizzard, and Jakob never pushed. Her past was a graveyard. Let it stay buried. She became his entire world, the only family he had left, the only family he'd ever need. Years passed in the rhythm of storms and silence. The blizzards came and went, marking the seasons with their howling fury. Jakob watched the small, half-frozen child grow into a woman. The quiet rhythm of their life together became Jakob's only purpose. Alara grew into someone extraordinary. Jakob had taught her how to set a broken bone, field strip a plasma rifle, and track a snowcat through a whiteout. In return, she taught him things he never knew existed, gleaned from salvaged data cores she devoured like novels, the physics of collapsing stars, the lost poetry of ancient Earth, the complex political history of the Valkorian Empire. She was the daughter of his heart, forged in ice and raised in the quiet solitude of his cabin. He was her dad, the only one she'd ever known. Her memories began with the blizzard, with the warmth of his coat, and for Jakob, that was a blessing. Their bond was absolute, unbreakable. She was his entire world. But recently, the past had begun to whisper. She spoke of them after her morning chores, strange, recurring dreams of a palace made of shimmering ice crystal, of long corridors that felt hauntingly familiar, and a woman's voice, sad and distant, calling a name that wasn't Alara. Then one evening, as she sat by the fire cleaning her hunting rifle, Jacob saw it. The silver markings on her temples, the ones that had marked her as highborn, began to emit a soft, violet light. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, a ghostly echo of her alien heritage. It lasted only a moment before fading, but Jacob's blood ran cold. He'd read about it in the data cores she'd found. The awakening, a sign of a Valkorian royal bloodline reaching maturity. For 20 years, he had built a wall around their life, a fortress of solitude to keep her safe. He had dreaded this day, prayed it would never come, because that faint, beautiful glow was not just a light, it was a beacon, and it was calling her real family home. It came without warning, not a storm, but a sound, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the pans on the wall. Jakob and Alara exchanged a look before stepping outside into the biting cold. There, hanging in the twilight sky above their small settlement, was a ship unlike any they had ever seen. It was a colossal spearhead of polished black metal and glowing violet light, a piece of impossible elegance against the rugged landscape of Frostholm. It blotted out the stars. The beacon had been answered. Within the hour, the entire planet was in a stir. A delegation descended, moving with an unnerving purpose. They weren't conquerors. They were emissaries, dressed in regal silver and deep purple, led by a stern-faced woman in a military-cut uniform and another whose robes flowed like liquid shadow. They carried devices that swept beams of pale light across the settlement, scanning, searching. Jakob watched from his window, a cold dread coiling in his gut. He knew what they were looking for. He knew it was only a matter of time. The knock on his door was heavy, official, final. Jakob placed a hand on Alara's shoulder, a silent promise he wasn't sure he could keep, and opened it. The two women from the delegation stood on his doorstep, their alien eyes immediately locking onto Alara. The military commander, her face a mask of discipline, held a small silver device. The other, an advisor with an air of ancient authority, gave a slight, sorrowful bow. "We are searching for the lost princess, Alara V. Sharon," the advisor, Lady Morel, said, her voice smooth but unyielding. "Kidnapped 20 years ago during the Vorath coup. She was presumed dead." Jacob's body went rigid. He tried to step in front of Alara to shield her, but it was too late. The commander, General Tarn, raised the scanner. A beam of white light washed over Alara, and the device emitted a single clear chime. Confirmation. Lady Morel's expression softened with a profound, world-altering truth. "Your genetic markers are a perfect match," she said, her eyes fixed on a stunned Alara. "Your name is Alara Vaisharan. You are the rightful heir to the Valkorian throne." The words hung in the frozen air, impossible and absolute. Alara stared, her hands trembling, the name from her dreams now a brand spoken into reality. But the royal advisor wasn't finished. She delivered the final, devastating blow that shattered the world Jakob had built. "Your mother, Queen Isara, she survived the coup. She has ruled in exile from a secret wing of the palace, and for 20 years, she has never stopped searching for you." Jacob's blood ran cold. He felt the world tilt, the solid ground of his life fracturing into a million pieces. A queen? A throne? It was the stuff of salvaged data dramas, not his reality. But the look in Alara's wide, terrified eyes was real. The chime of that scanner was real. 20 years ago, Lady Morel began, her voice a low, somber current, "Your mother's own cousin, Duke Vorath, orchestrated a coup to seize the throne." Jakob's mind, trained for tactical analysis, began assembling the enemy profile. A cousin. A traitor. "He failed to kill the queen," Morel continued, "but he succeeded in convincing the royal council that she and her infant daughter had perished. He hired a band of cutthroat mercenaries to abduct you, princess, and abandon you on the most remote, inhospitable planet they could find. A place no one would ever look. A place where a child could never survive." The words struck Jakob like a physical blow. He remembered the local magistrate's casual remark all those years ago, likely disposed of by political rivals. It wasn't a guess. It was the truth. The blizzard hadn't been a random tragedy. It had been a murder weapon, and he, Jakob, had been the one to disarm it. "The Duke now serves as head regent of Valcor," General Taryn added, her voice sharp as shrapnel. "He has spent 2 decades consolidating his power, waiting for the council to officially declare the royal line extinct so he can be crowned. Our mission here is unsanctioned, a secret known only to the Queen's most loyal followers. If Vorath discovers you are alive before we can return you to the capital, he will not hesitate. He will send assassins. He will finish the job." Assassins. The word hung in the air, a promise of violence. Jakob looked from the stoic general to the stunned, pale face of his daughter, his Alara. They spoke of her as a political asset, a symbol to be moved into position. They saw a princess. He saw the little girl who used to fall asleep with her head on his shoulder while he repaired hydrocoils. He saw the young woman who could field strip a pulse rifle blindfolded and suture a wound in near darkness. They wanted to take her from this cabin, from the only home she had ever known, and throw her into a nest of liars and killers. A world that had already tried to murder her once. His entire being recoiled at the thought, but the purpose he had found that day in the snow, that purpose was now roaring inside him like a furnace. Jakob took a step forward, his shadow falling over Alara. His voice was a low, dangerous growl, the sound of a promise being forged in fire. "She's not going anywhere without me." Alara, her face a mask of shock and newfound resolve, turned to face General Taryn. "He's not a mercenary you can hire or dismiss," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "He's my father. If I go, he goes with me. As my personal guardian, that is not negotiable." Jakob felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost buckled his knees. He was 55 years old, and the aches from a lifetime of hard living and harder fighting were a constant companion. The thought of stepping onto a starship bound for a political snake pit made every one of them scream in protest. But the thought of letting Alara face it alone was infinitely worse. He nodded once, a silent, unbreakable pact. "Where she goes, I go." The week-long journey to Valcor Prime was a disorienting blend of sterile opulence and suffocating tension. The Valkorian ship was a cathedral of polished chrome and glowing ice crystal conduits, a world away from the rough-hewn wood and salvaged metal of their cabin. While General Taryn began Alara's crash course in royal etiquette and combat drills, revealing a terrifying, innate aptitude for leadership in the young woman, Jakob found himself in a different kind of negotiation. It happened via hologram. Queen Isara, a projection of shimmering blue light, was everything the stories implied. Regal, poised, her face an unreadable sculpture of grace and sorrow. Her voice was like the calm surface of a frozen lake, but her eyes held a storm of gratitude when she looked at Jacob. "Words are inadequate, Master Heron," she said during their first conversation, her form flickering in the comms chamber. "You saved the future of my entire world. You saved my entire world." "I just saved a little girl from freezing to death," Jacob said gruffly, uncomfortable with the praise. "The rest is complicated." "Yes," Isara agreed, a flicker of pain crossing her features. "Vorath complicates everything." Over the long ship nights, their conversations deepened. They were opposites, the elegant queen and the gruff survivalist. Yet they found a stark and powerful common ground. They were both survivors of Duke Vorath's ambition. He had stolen her daughter and her throne. He was indirectly responsible for the military disaster that had cost Jakob his career, his honor, and the family he was born into. A wound he never spoke of, but which Isara seemed to sense in his silences. "He takes what is most precious," Isara murmured one night, her voice losing its royal composure for a fleeting moment. "He leaves nothing but ghosts behind." Jacob found himself replying, his gaze drifting to a monitor showing Alara disarming Tyrn in a sparring match. "Ghosts learn how to fight back." A strange warmth bloomed in his chest as he spoke to the Queen of Ice, a connection forged in shared loss and a desperate shared hope. A hope that would soon face its greatest test. The ship descended into a city that seemed carved from a single, colossal glacier. Spires of iridescent ice clawed at the sky, and bridges of frozen light connected shimmering towers. Valcor Prime was beautiful, cold, and utterly alien. To Jakob, it felt like a magnificent prison. They were escorted through echoing, crystalline halls to the Queen's exile wing, and there, standing before a window that looked out onto a frozen sea, was Queen Isara. She was no longer a shimmering hologram, but a woman of flesh and blood, more beautiful and more sorrowful than her projection had ever conveyed. Her eyes, the same deep violet as Ilara's, locked onto her daughter, and for a moment, 20 years of grief, guilt, and desperate hope shattered her royal composure. Ilara took a hesitant step forward, then another before she broke into a run. "Mother?" she whispered, the word a fragile thing. Isara met her halfway, wrapping her in an embrace that was a collision of worlds. The sound of their shared sobs was the only thing that filled the cavernous chamber. Jakob stood back with General Tyrn, feeling like a ghost witnessing a miracle. Isara finally pulled back, her hands framing Alara's face, her gaze drinking in every detail. Then her eyes found Jacob's. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her voice was steady. "You taught her kindness," Isara said, her gratitude a physical force in the room. "In a galaxy that taught me only cruelty, you showed her strength and gave her a home. I have no words to thank you, Jakob Heron." That night they shared a small, private dinner. For a few hours, the titles of Queen and Princess and Duke faded away. They were just Isara, Alara, and Jakob, a fragile, impossible family sharing a meal. The ornate ice-glass window behind Isara shattered inwards, and two figures in black thermal armor burst through. A plasma bolt hissed past Jakob's ear, melting a deep scar into the wall. Instinct, honed over a lifetime of violence, took over. "Alara, down!" he roared, shoving her chair over and diving across the table, pulling Isara with him. General Tyrn was already moving, her ceremonial sidearm drawn and firing. The corridor erupted into chaos. More assassins poured in, their weapons silent but deadly. A spy. They'd been sold out. Jacob came up with a heavy, ornate chair in his hands, smashing it into the first assassin and feeling the satisfying crunch of a helmet cracking. He and Tyrn fell into a deadly rhythm, back to back in the narrow corridor, a storm of fists, blades, and blaster fire. A guard went down, clutching a smoldering wound in his chest. Through the blur of combat, Jacob saw Alara. She wasn't hiding. She was on her knees beside the fallen guard, ripping fabric from her own fine gown to pack his wound, her hands moving with the swift, sure competence he had taught her. She was saving a life in the middle of a firefight. Pride surged through him, hot and fierce. The fight was brutal and short. When it was over, the corridor was littered with the bodies of Voreth's agents. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Their safety was an illusion. Isara rose, her face a mask of cold fury. She looked at the carnage, at her daughter tending to a wounded man, and at the man who had twice now thrown himself between her family and death. Her decision was instant. "He knows she's here," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "The time for secrets is over. We will not wait for him to strike again. We will bring the mountain to him." Isara's cold fury had settled into something far more dangerous. Strategy. She led them to a hidden chamber behind a tapestry, a war room filled with holographic displays and star charts. "For 20 years, she began, her voice low and sharp, "I have been a queen in a cage, but a caged animal does not forget how to hunt." She gestured to a swirling vortex of data. "I have financial records showing Voreth's payments to mercenary guilds. I have encrypted communications he thought were deleted. I have the deathbed confession of the pilot who flew the transport that abandoned my daughter on your world." Jacob stared, stunned by the sheer weight of her long, lonely war. It was an arsenal of evidence. "This is enough to bury him," he said. "It's enough to start a civil war," Isara corrected, her expression grim. "The council is loyal to him out of fear and greed. To depose a regent, the evidence must be absolute, undeniable, and presented in a way that shatters his power base instantly. I need one final piece." She pulled up a schematic of the palace's most secure wing. The royal archives. They contain the original investigation files for Alara's kidnapping, the ones Voreth personally oversaw and falsified. The original data logs will prove he orchestrated the cover-up from the very beginning. "So we get them," Jacob said, his military mind already calculating entry points. "It's not that simple," Isara replied, her gaze falling on Alara. "The vault is sealed by a genetic lock that predates the Empire. It can only be opened by a member of the royal bloodline whose heritage is fully awakened." Jacob saw it then, the faint, shimmering light under his daughter's skin, the glowing markings he'd secretly feared for years. Isara continued, her voice heavy with dread. "Ilara's connection is growing, but it isn't complete. To open the vault, she must undergo the rite of ascension." General Tarn stiffened. A silence fell over the room, thick with unspoken horror. "What is that?" Jacob asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "It is an ancient, dangerous ceremony," Isara said, unable to meet his eyes. "A trial of psychic and physical endurance. It forces a communion with our ancestors and the planet itself. If she is deemed worthy, it will complete the awakening, giving her full access to her heritage. If she is not," Isara's voice broke, "it will kill her." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. "No," he said, the word a flat, iron command. "Absolutely not. We'll find another way. We'll storm the archives, bribe a guard, blow the damn door off its hinges. But you will not put her through a ritual that could kill her. I didn't pull her out of a blizzard just to watch you sacrifice her to some tradition." His voice was rising, the protective fury he'd felt during the assassination attempt returning tenfold. He took a step towards Alara, as if to shield her. But it was Alara who spoke, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound steel. "Dad." He stopped, turning to her. Her violet eyes, so much like her mother's, were clear and resolute. She was no longer the lost girl from the storm or the confused young woman from the ship. She was a princess finding her purpose. "For 20 years, you taught me how to survive," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "But you taught me more than that. You taught me to protect those who can't protect themselves. Varath has held this world hostage for 2 decades. My people are suffering under his rule." She looked from Jacob to her mother, her expression softening with love and resolve. "Now I have to protect an entire world." The air in the Chamber of Ancestors was colder than the blizzard that had first brought them together. Alara stood in the center of a dais carved from black, star-flecked obsidian, her eyes closed. Frost crept across the floor towards her bare feet as a low hum of energy filled the vast ancient hall. This was the rite, a trial of ice and memory. Jacob stood beside Isara in the shadows, his hands clenched into fists, every instinct screaming at him to pull Alara out of there. He was a man of action, and all he could do was watch, helpless. He could see the strain on Alara's face, the shivers that racked her body despite the strange internal light that was beginning to pulse from her silver markings. He felt Isara tremble beside him. "I've spent 20 years searching for her," she whispered, her voice raw with a queen's agony and a mother's terror. "And now I've led her here to this. I'm so afraid I'm going to lose her all over again." Jakob's gaze never left Alara, but he spoke to Isara. "She's stronger than you think, stronger than any of us." But his own fear was a knot of ice in his gut. "When I found her," he admitted, his voice barely a rasp, "I had nothing. I'd lost everything that ever mattered to me. I was just waiting for the end. She became my reason to get up in the morning." He finally turned to look at Isara, his gruff exterior cracking to reveal the wounded man beneath. "I'm terrified of losing the only family I have left." In the cold, oppressive silence, Isara reached out and took his hand. Her skin was cool, but her grip was firm, a lifeline in the darkness. She saw the same pain in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. "We are her family," she said softly. Slowly, she leaned in, and he met her halfway. Their first kiss wasn't one of sudden passion, but of shared desperation and profound understanding. It was the closing of a circuit between two broken souls, a quiet promise in the face of unbearable suspense. Pulling back, Azara kept her hand in his, her eyes holding his gaze. "You gave her life twice," she said, her voice shaking with conviction. "Once in the blizzard, and once by giving her a home. You are her true father, Jakob. Nothing will ever change that." Just then, the humming in the chamber intensified. A blinding column of violet light erupted from the dais, engulfing Alara. Jakob's heart stopped, but when the light receded, she was still standing. Her head was high, her posture radiating a power that hadn't been there before. Her silver markings were no longer faint, but blazed like molten starlight, a living crown woven into her skin. She opened her eyes, the same violet eyes, but now filled with the wisdom of generations, and smiled. She stepped off the dais and walked not to one, but to both of them. Without a word, Alara wrapped her arms around Jakob and Isara, pulling them into a tight embrace. The reclusive medic, the exiled queen, and the lost princess, finally a family, forged in ice and fire. The archives were silent and cold, a stark contrast to the distant, muffled sounds of the state dinner. Shadow and light danced across rows of crystalline data servers as Jacob, General Tyern, and Alara moved like ghosts through the secured sector. They reached a massive vault door of polished obsidian, unmarked by any handle or keypad. This was it. Alara stepped forward, her face set with determination. She placed her palm flat against the door. Her silver markings flared to life, casting a violet glow across their tense faces. A low chime echoed through the chamber, and with a hiss of depressurizing air, the colossal door slid open. Inside, the air was frigid, thick with the smell of ozone and ancient ice. They found the sealed case quickly, labeled with the investigation number Isara had given them. As Alara worked to decrypt the data core, Jacob stood guard, his hand resting on his sidearm, every nerve alight. "I have it," Alara whispered, pulling the core free. "Everything. The original orders, the payment transfers. He signed it all himself." A triumphant smile was on her lips when the vault door behind them slammed shut. Red emergency lights bathed the chamber in a hellish glow. From the shadows between the servers, a figure emerged. Lady Morel. Her serene advisor's smile was gone, replaced by a cold sneer. "A touching family reunion," she said, a compact plasma pistol appearing in her hand. "But the Duke is not a sentimental man." "Morel!" Taryn snarled, her own weapon drawn instantly. "You're the spy." "The Queen is a relic," Morel spat, gesturing to a terminal. "Vorath is the future." She began typing furiously. "And in a few moments, this entire archive, along with you, will be permanently erased." "Alara, the data!" Jacob yelled, lunging not at Morel, but at the control panel beside her. General Tarn moved to cover Alara, who frantically jammed the data core into a nearby broadcast port. A frantic upload began. Morel was faster than Jacob expected. She dropped her pistol and produced a wicked-looking vibro knife, sidestepping his charge and driving the blade into his side. A white-hot agony exploded through Jacob's body, stealing his breath. He grunted, the sound a mix of pain and fury, and staggered back. But he didn't fall. Fueled by a lifetime of instinct and a father's protective rage, he ignored the searing pain and tackled Morel, slamming her against the server racks. They grappled, a desperate, brutal fight in the flashing red light. "Get it out!" Terrence shouted, firing suppression shots that forced Morel's hidden guards to stay in cover. "Almost there!" Ilara cried, her eyes locked on the progress bar. 99%. With a final, desperate heave, Jacob disarmed Morel and threw her into the path of one of Terran's stun blasts. The advisor crumpled to the floor, unconscious. At the same moment, Ilara shouted, "Done! It's uploaded!" The fight was over. The silence that fell was broken only by Jacob's ragged breathing. He looked down, pressing a hand to his side. It came away slick and dark with blood. The same side he'd clutched 20 years ago, fighting the hypothermia of the blizzard. He had bled for her then, and he was bleeding for her now. He met Ilara's terrified gaze and gave her a weak, grim smile before his knees buckled. The mission complete. The cost paid once more. The great hall of the Valkorian Senate fell silent as Queen Isara ascended the dais. The air, usually humming with political discourse, was thick with a tension so profound it felt like the moments before a lightning strike. At her side stood Ilara, regal and composed in royal silver, her very presence a judgment. And just behind them, a bandaged and grim-faced Jacob Heron stood as living proof of the cost of her return. He leaned slightly, the fresh wound in his side a throbbing, white-hot reminder of his purpose. Izara's voice, amplified throughout the chamber, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of ice. An emergency session has been called. A truth, 20 years buried, has been unearthed. On the massive holoscreen behind her, the evidence began to play. Financial records showing massive payments from Duke Vorath's personal accounts to known mercenary guilds. Audio logs of a dying soldier confessing his role in kidnapping a child. And then the files from the Royal Archives, the original, unaltered orders for Ilara's disposal, signed with Vorath's own encrypted royal seal. Finally, Lady Morel's confession played, her face pale under interrogation lights as she detailed 2 decades of treason. A collective gasp swept through the assembled senators. All eyes turned to Duke Vorath. The Duke, who had entered the chamber with an arrogant smirk, was now ashen. The mask of civility shattered, revealing the cornered predator beneath. "Lies! Fabrications!" he roared, his voice cracking. He jabbed a trembling finger at the dais. "This is a coup! My guards! Seize them!" He waited. No one moved. From the edge of the chamber, General Terran stepped forward. "Your personal guard and every officer loyal to you were taken into custody an hour ago, my lord. They are awaiting their own trials for treason." Checkmate. The trap was sprung. The beast was caged. Vorath's eyes, wild and furious, darted from Isara's cold fury to Jacob's grim satisfaction. Then they landed on Ilara, on the daughter who should have died in the snow. In a final insane act of desperation, he let out an animalistic snarl. A concealed plasma blade hissed to life in his hand, a blade of pure violet energy. He lunged not at Isara, the architect of his downfall, but at Ilara, the symbol of his failure. Time seemed to slow. Jakob saw the flash of light, the murderous intent in Vorath's eyes. Pain forgotten, weakness ignored, his body moved on pure instinct. He threw himself in front of Ilara. He wasn't fast enough to block it completely. The blade's searing heat sliced across his arm and chest. A glancing blow that sent a fresh explosion of agony through him. But it was enough. The lunge was broken. Before Vorath could strike again, Isara's royal guards swarmed him, a blur of silver armor and crackling stun batons. The Duke went down with a choked cry, the plasma blade clattering to the polished floor. The conspiracy was over, silenced not by politics or debate, but by the raw, decisive finality of a father's love. The trial of Duke Vorath was less a debate and more a formal sentencing. The evidence was absolute, the treason undeniable. He and his co-conspirators were condemned to life imprisonment on the desolate ice moons of Valkor's outer rim, a fate many considered a mercy they didn't deserve. With their conviction, the corrupt Regent Council was dissolved, and the Valkorian Senate voted as one, restoring Queen Asara to her full, sovereign power. Days later, the Great Hall was transformed. Gone was the tension of the confrontation, replaced by the brilliant light of a new dawn. Isara was formally recrowned, the diadem of stars placed upon her head. Then it was Alara's turn. As she was proclaimed crowned princess and heir to the throne, a roar of approval shook the palace to its foundations. But before the ceremony could conclude, Alara raised a hand for silence. She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the assembled dignitaries before landing on the man standing beside her mother's throne. Jakob, his arm in a sling, his expression a mixture of pride and awe. "My life was given to me twice," Alara's voice rang out, clear and strong. "Once by my mother, Queen Asara, and once by a man who found me dying in a blizzard, who took me in, who raised me, and who taught me that strength is measured not by power, but by compassion. He is the only father I have ever known." She turned to the Senate. "Therefore I, Crown Princess Alara Ve Sharon, formally petition this assembly. I ask that you bestow upon Jakob Heron the title of Royal Protector, and that you create for him the new title of Prince Consort, formally adopting him into the royal line of my family." A stunned silence fell over the hall. Then a single senator stood and began to applaud. Another followed, and another, until the entire chamber was on its feet in a thunderous, unanimous ovation. As the noise swelled, Isara moved to Jakob's side, her eyes shining with tears and love. She took his hand, lifting it for all to see. "The Senate has spoken," she declared, her voice carrying over the applause. "And I, Queen Asara, declare my own intention. I will be taking Prince Consort Jakob Heron as my husband, uniting the family that saved our world." Jacob stood frozen, the roar of the crowd fading to a distant hum. The reclusive medic who had sought only solitude, the broken soldier who wanted to be left alone with his ghosts, now found himself at the very heart of a royal family. He wasn't just a guard or a savior anymore. He was a father, a prince, and the future king. He had walked into a blizzard to save one life, and in doing so, had found a new one for himself. 6 months later, the Ice Palace felt different. The cold, crystalline walls that once echoed with conspiracy now seemed to hum with a quiet warmth. Hope had returned to Valkor Prime, and its source was the Crown Princess. Alara moved through her duties with a grace that was part royal bloodline and part mountain girl grit. She established new trade routes and reformed corrupt councils, but her proudest achievement was the network of advanced medical clinics she funded across the remote settlements of Frostholm, honoring the simple life that had shaped her. Jakob, now Prince Consort and Royal Protector, stood as her chief advisor and Isara's devoted partner. His tactical mind and medic's pragmatism were invaluable to the crown, but his most important role was that of a father and husband. In a quiet corner of the palace gardens, he had built a small memorial of polished river stones, one for each year of the life of the daughter he had lost so long ago. The ghosts of his past were finally at peace. On the anniversary of the rescue, the three of them returned to Frostholm. The royal ship landed a respectful distance away, and they walked the final stretch to the old homestead. The air was sharp, the snow just as deep, but this time there was no blizzard, only a brilliant clear sky. Together they placed a simple, carved monument of native stone near the spot where he had found her. Alara traced the inscription with her gloved hand, reading it aloud. "Here, a father's love saved a princess. Here, a family was born." Jacob looked from the monument to the two women beside him. He took Asara's hand, his other arm wrapping around Alara's shoulders, pulling them close. A small, peaceful smile touched his lips. "I went into that blizzard expecting to die alone someday," he said, his voice a low rumble in the stillness. "Instead, I found a reason to live. Twice." The three of them turned and began the walk back, their figures casting long shadows on the pristine snow. A family forged not by blood alone, but by sacrifice, love, and the unwavering choice to protect one another.